Good morning, everyone. It's a real honor to introduce our guest speaker for this morning. I think we at the Abbey here, we believe in literature. We believe that literature has the power to move the soul, to inspire our imaginations, and to help us discern the best way of life. For me, I know personally, I was at college studying Shakespeare and my mentor. That really just changed my life. And so to help us explore today the power of literature and to help us understand why literature matters is our speaker, Dr. Glenn Arbery. Dr. Arbery, thank you. Dr. Arbery is the president of Wyoming Catholic College, where he has also taught in the Humanities since 2013. He has taught literature at the University of St. Thomas, Thomas More College of the Liberal Arts, the University of Dallas, and Assumption College in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's also served as director of the Teachers Academy at the Dallas Institute for Humanities and Culture. He's author of Why Literature Matters, and editor of The Tragic Abyss, Augustine's Confessions and Its Influence, and The Southern Critics. Dr. Arbery is going to speak for about 30 minutes today, and then you have time to ask some questions after that until we go to class and sit down. Okay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Glenn Arbery.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back here at Portsmouth Abbey. The last time I was here was, I think, 2010 or 11 maybe. It was a conference on whether Shakespeare was a secret Catholic in the Protestant England of Queen Elizabeth I. And as I recall, there were three different views on this matter. First was that Shakespeare had coded his plays to reveal to a few other secret Catholics his identification with the Catholic Church. There was another view that he didn't really have any particular affiliation, but that he used religion for its dramatic purposes. And the third one was that he wrote within the context of redemption and recreated the old festive England of the Catholic folk in his comedies. But if he was Catholic, one thing we can say is that he avoided martyrdom, unlike his contemporary, the Jesuit poet Robert Southwell. In any case, Shakespeare's importance for us stems less from his Catholic identity per se than from the greatness of his poetry, in which case he's like Homer or Dante. And thinking today with you about why literature matters, I want to ask a different question involving Shakespeare and identity. What he can tell us about identity itself, because the politics of identity, which was a matter of life and death for a Catholic in England, has become a different kind of problem in our age. Maybe you're spared here at Portsmouth Abbey, as we are at Wyoming Catholic College. But in the culture at large, the politics of identity threatens the very possibility of unity in any great common cause. Identity politics today starts with grievance. Someone feels the effect of prejudice, especially if it involves race, class, or gender, and looks for a zone of solidarity with others who feel similarly victimized. In the South, when I was growing up, there were real injustices against black people just because they were black. And the civil rights movement led to a change in the laws. These laws could not outlaw prejudice itself, but they took away the legal power of prejudice with remarkable results. It's hard to explain to anybody who didn't grow up in the South in those days what the radical difference is between the Georgia of 1959 and the South of 2019. A new unity seems conceivable. But identity politics needs to keep grievances fresh, because being a victim paradoxically gives you a privileged political status. Now we're deep into the domain of the thought police in George Orwell's 1984. People are publicly shamed and driven from their jobs because of a tweet or a public comment that could be considered prejudiced in some way. Instead of honoring our national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one, the tendency seems to be an increasing fragmentation into more and more groups that seek only to assert the rights of their particular identities. Diversity per se, instead of unity and the common good of all. Now, what does identity politics have to do with literature? Far too much. The tendency of people to identify with victimized groups tends to make them see culture only in terms of these groups. I've got a cold, on the way, so if you excuse me, I'm going to have. So group identity tends to be the way that people think about how they see literature. If someone outside wears the clothes or speaks in a certain way, characteristic of their group, it's called cultural appropriation, because identity politics considers it crucially important not to let others pretend to understand that group identity. If some writer imaginatively crosses the boundary, there could be an immediate backlash. Publishers even voluntarily withdraw books that someone might accuse of being politically incorrect. Just last year, the novelist Lionel Shriver objected that, quote, preventing writers from conjuring lives different from their own would spell the end of fiction, because if we have the right to draw on only our own experience, all that's left is memoir. That's exactly it. What troubles me is the attempt to restrict the poetic imagination within the limits of these narrow understandings of identity. Why should it be forbidden, and some would like to forbid it, for a white male writer today to imagine what it would be like to be a black teenage girl growing up in the middle Georgia of the 1950s? It's a way of understanding. Or for a Norwegian woman to imagine being a Hopi warrior in northwestern Arizona 1,000 years ago. A poet or novelist or playwright thrives on the possibility of entering the minds of others. Obviously, there might be errors of cultural detail, but would we really want Shakespeare not to have imagined the magnificent language of Othello, the Moor of Venice, or Isabella's ferocious chastity in Measure for Measure? Would it have been more appropriate somehow if Jane Austen had never imagined Mr. Darcy or Mr. Knightley or Mr. Collins for that matter? No, because identity is subject to imaginative access from outside. In the Poetics, Aristotle writes that the two most important elements of tragedy are plot and character. And I want to think about what the poet does with identity. It's become customary to stress identity more than character, which is really a more important idea, at least in terms of tragedy. But the word identity comes from Latin idem, the same. So it has to do with the unique sameness of a person or thing in different times and circumstances. It centers on the same self. But the word character emphasizes the nature of our response to the real world outside ourselves. It's interesting if you think about what the original meaning of the word character was. It was like a letter, something marked on you or onto some material. If we're thinking about a character in a film or novel, say Huckleberry Finn, we're really talking about the unique identity that keeps him the same person throughout the novel. Y'all read that here? Anybody read Huckleberry Finn? Some of you heard. So Huckleberry Finn, penniless, semi-grammatical, right? The book starts, you don't know about me without you've read, and so on. Keenly observant, quick-witted, the son of an abusive drunk. So that's, in a sense, the identity of Huckleberry Finn. Whereas the total impression that he makes in his dealings with the people he meets on his trip down to Mississippi with Jim, the escaping slave, constitute what we understand as his character. Jim's identity is harder to grasp because he's almost denied one. But the nobility of the total impression, his character, couldn't be more evident. Let's think about identity then. How the poet can convincingly take on other unique identities from within. I'm using poet in its largest sense as the maker of the work of art, the novelist, the playwright, the filmmaker. The poet enters other identities, becomes this person or that. Milton's Satan, Aphrodite in the Iliad, or the dog Laska in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. How does he or she do it? Most important is self-forgetful observation. Part of what we call the poetic imagination at Wyoming Catholic College centers on observation, close-up, of realities of the natural world. Sheer rock cliffs, whitewater rapids, mountain caves that do not forgive self-absorbed inattention. In the horsemanship course that our students take one semester, they learn to ride by coming to understand the particular identity of the horse they're given, spirited storm, or lethargic star, or irritable Zeke. Riding requires adapting themselves to the nature of the animal. And some students sit there for a long time unable to get the horse to move because they can't at first get past some inner block that keeps them from being able to relate to the animal. And think about, on the contrary, someone who is a true horseman. In the Iliad, you might remember that Hector is called breaker of horses, Hippodamia. He's the one who somehow masters the horse. And what does that kind of mastery mean? By the way, great leaders are often also, in the tradition, great horsemen. George Washington was said to have been the greatest horseman of his day, as was Ulysses S. Grant. He was known before he was ever in the Civil War for his horsemanship. So with these people, there's a sympathetic mastery that doesn't impose the rider's overpowering will onto the animal, but shows this effortless understanding of that animal. There's an analogy here to the true poet. To the poet like Shakespeare, any block between the self and the other vanishes. Ego, in the usual sense, disappears in observation. Just before his 23rd birthday, the English poet John Keats, who was about 2 years away from his own death when he wrote this, he died of tuberculosis at 25. Keats wrote to a friend of his, "If a sparrow comes before my window, I take part in its existence and pick about in the ground." Just think about that image for a minute. Seeing him, he's there looking out the window, he sees a sparrow, and his sense isn't to stay in himself, but to pick about in the gravel with the sparrow. He explains this identification in a letter to his friend Richard Woodhouse. "When I'm in a room with people," Keats says, "if I'm ever free from speculating on creations of my own brain, then not myself goes home to myself, but the identity of everyone in the room begins to press upon me, so that I am in a very little time annihilated, not only among men, it would be the same in a nursery of children." What does he mean? Not myself goes home to myself. Basically, that he has no ego in the usual sense. If he were here in this room, he would lose himself in observing the identity of all of you. Keats doesn't regret not having a high-profile ego, which he calls the egotistical sublime. Love that phrase. It's easy to think of examples of the egotistical sublime in our day. He writes to Woodhouse that the poetical character is not itself. It has no self. It's everything and nothing. It has no character. It enjoys light and shade. It lives in gusto, be it foul or fair, high or low, rich or poor, mean or elevated. It has as much delight in conceiving an Iago as in imaging. Iago is, of course, the villain in Shakespeare's tragedy Othello, which is about the general, the Moor, who is chosen as the general of the Venetians, who marries a young Venetian woman. They elope, and then having been passed over for a promotion, one of Othello's under-officers begins to plot against them to convince Othello that Desdemona is having an affair with this handsome younger officer. So there are racial issues involved, there are age issues involved, and Iago works everybody with a kind of stunning insight. Imogen is in Cymbeline, a kind of wronged wife, slandered wife, in a way similar to Desdemona. But Keats's point is that Shakespeare can be either of these. He loves to conceive of characters with this kind of difference. Sometimes people are disappointed when they meet an actor or a writer that they admire. And I think if you take Keats at his word here, you'll see why. Because true poets and actors don't often have vivid identities. Would Shakespeare walk through a crowded London marketplace, for example, being the sublime William Shakespeare, soon to be world renowned, here's my autograph? Or would he forget himself in the press of characters, the shrews, the pretentious drunkards, the young lovers, the sober old men, the quarrelsome Tybalts and Mercutios? A poet, says Keats, has no identity. He's continually in for and filling some other body. The sun, the moon, the sea, and men and women who are creatures of impulse are poetical and have about them an unchangeable attribute. This is still Keats. The poet has none, no identity. He is certainly the most unpoetical of all God's creatures. So, no identity, unpoetical. But again, Keats is not lamenting this lack of identity. He's not talking about the poet's miserably low self-esteem, but about delight, as though it were the sheer pleasure of conceiving another distinct and vivid character that moved the poet. So in order to write Iago's lines in Othello, Shakespeare has to occupy from within the soul of a wicked man who relishes his wickedness. Iago observes other people closely, finds their weaknesses, and manipulates them for their own ends. He's a kind of demonic playwright of real lives. He enjoys getting the black general Othello to smother his innocent young wife and then kill himself in remorse. Plato warned against imitating or playing low or wicked characters because it would lower the moral self-understanding of the person who did it. So doesn't writing Iago's lines leave its taint on Shakespeare? Not at all, says Keats. What shocks the virtuous philosopher, he writes, delights the chameleon poet. It does no harm from its relish of the dark side of things, any more than from its taste for the bright one, because they both end in speculation. Now again, notice the poet's delight in this capacity that leads to speculation. And speculation here, I think, means new questions, new surmises about reality, not dreamt of in your philosophy, as Hamlet says to Horatio. A great poet ranges across all human possibilities accessible to the imagination, not just those that fall within his own identity group. Not only can Shakespeare enter Iago's darkly malicious uniqueness, but also the soul of Romeo, or Othello, or Shylock, or a virtuous but wrongly slandered wife like Imogen, or the mind of the domineering Roman mother like Volumnia, the great name, Volumnia in Coriolanus. He can be old King Lear, furiously banishing his daughter, or he can be Lady Macbeth. He can imagine the self-important Bottom the Weaver in Midsummer Night's Dream, or the self-consciously noble Brutus in Julius Caesar, who lets himself be convinced to murder his friend and benefactor. In all of these, Shakespeare broadens our human sympathies. This capacity to become others underlies the very possibility of literature. At the beginning of the poetic tradition in the West, Homer gives us the image of the shape-shifting god, Proteus. In the Odyssey, Menelaus tells Telemachus the story of how, in order to find out how to get home, he has to capture the god Proteus and force him to give the answer. So, having been instructed by the sea goddess how to do this, Menelaus and his men have to disguise themselves as seals, pulling these seal skins over themselves and lying on the beach so that they can leap up and surprise Proteus and trap him. Menelaus complains about the smell. In fact, they have to have ambrosia, that immortal substance of the god, into their nostrils so they can stand it for a few minutes. But here's what Menelaus says to Telemachus. We, with a cry, sprang up and rushed upon him, locking him in our arms. But the old man did not forget his subtlety. And first he turned into a great bearded lion, and then to a serpent, then to a leopard, and then to a great boar. And he turned into fluid water, to a tree with towering branches. But we held stiffly onto him with enduring spirit. Menelaus can get his questions answered, but only if he and his men hang on through all these metamorphoses. In this sense, Menelaus is like us, the reader or audience in search of poetic wisdom. Proteus is a character in the poem, but also the poet who accesses the primordial malleability that underlies both the imagination and the natural world. The true poet reaches down into the quick of creation itself and touches the mystery of existence. But what if something blocks this possibility? I'm thinking of the prohibitions of identity politics, of course. I'm also thinking about that kind of personal block that the person who can't get the horse to move would have. But also, I'm reminded of William Wordsworth's great sonnet, The World is Too Much With Us, which centers on a general loss of poetic capacity in the modern world. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We've given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This seed that bears her bosom to the moon. The winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Now, who knows how many times I've read this poem? I know it by heart, as does every student at Wyoming Catholic College. It's one of the 30 or more that they memorize. But I love the way that Wordsworth moves directly from that kind of generic language, we have given our hearts away, sort of into the vivid personification of the next line, which repeats the image, but this time with a kind of visceral vividness. The sea that bears her bosom to the moon. I love the explosive way Wordsworth uses that turn in the conventional sonnet form. You have 8 lines and you have 6 lines. The 6 lines sort of answer the first 8. He gets to the end of the 8th line, and then he says, it moves us not, and credit God. I'd rather be, it's a kind of explosive way of moving the first part of the poem into the last part. But never until I was thinking about this talk did it strike me why Wordsworth chooses Proteus as the old pagan god he'd like to see. You think about the meter of the poem, the way he could have written a line, he could easily have written Neptune instead. have cited Neptune rising from the sea. That'd be vivid, right? Or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Triton's actually the son of Neptune, so it would work that way. But instead, he doesn't want the egotistical sublime. He doesn't want Neptune. He wants Proteus, because this God embodies the powers of imagination, to enter other selves, to take on the forms of the world, to imagine the sea bearing her bosom to the moon. Powers that have been laid waste, as he complains, in our busy modernity. Now, Shakespeare has these powers, but he's not sentimental about the poetic capacity to observe others and gain access to their identities imaginatively. He knows better than anyone that friendship and goodwill are more important than the capacity to observe and understand others. Iago can see into the unsuspecting souls of those around him. And so can Richard of Gloucester, later Richard III, who explains how he'll use the arts of deception as he plots his murderous ascent to the throne. If you don't know Richard III, he's way down in the line of succession. He's got his brother is now king, his other brother is still alive. His brother who's king has 2 children. So Richard methodically and very cleverly murders them all and becomes king. And as he's plotting this, he's giving a soliloquy where he says, I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and like a Sinon take another Troy. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this, and can I get a crown? The whole speech is the boast of an evil man who can deceive and emotionally disable others on his way to power. So this characteristic, chameleonic, shape-shifting ability that the poet has is both liberating and troubling. Many of Shakespeare's most appealing characters take on disguises. Edgar in Kent and King Lear, Portia in The Merchant of Venice, you can probably think of other examples. Rosalind and As You Like It, just to name a few. And all of them do it to bring about some otherwise unattainable good. But his greatest villains are also adept at reading others and creating false impressions about themselves. Everybody in the Iago's kind of a sergeant type, right? He wasn't named for the lieutenancy. He got passed over, and this is part of what moves him to work against the fellow. But everybody calls him Honest Iago. He seems like the most honest guy you could ever meet. So, creating this false impression is one of the, is part of the genius of what Iago can do. He can observe others so well and so accurately predict their responses that he can marshal them to their own destruction. Playing off the line in Hamlet, I just realized, marshal into knavery. In one of his sonnets, Shakespeare writes about the effect of writing for the stage, complaining that his nature is almost subdued to what it works in, like the dyer's hand. So to ask the question again, does Shakespeare bear the moral stain of taking on the inmost idiom of truly evil characters? I have to say no again, because one of the characteristics of great literature is that it convincingly shows the consequences of the choices that someone makes. Iago chooses to do what he does because of some flaw in his capacity for friendship or love. He deceives and manipulates others because of some inner darkness, and then these lies and murderous ruses increasingly constitute the character of Iago that we as readers or audience of the play perceive. The total impression that he makes on us is undoubtedly horrific. It's not to say that he's not smarter and funnier. Same thing's true of Richard III, for that matter. When you read him or you see his soliloquies, you're kind of with him. I mean, it's fun to kind of be in his mind. We enjoy Iago because he's, wickedly perceptive about people. He can see right through them and name, what it is that you wouldn't have said, but I guess you're right, and yet, as he does all this, as he manipulates people, gets the fellow to murder his own wife, we're watching somebody who's sociopathic. And any normal reader ends up horrified. What you're looking at with Iago by the end of the play is something like the mystery of iniquity. It's the whole experience of the character engaged in a choice and its consequences that Aristotle calls the action of a work. One of my colleagues at Wyoming Catholic College likes to point out that imaginative participation in literature actually affects the chemistry of the brain. So neurologists can show that if a reader really imagines sword fighting or swimming or running, the same part of the brain lights up as if you're actually doing that. And that, I think, also applies to feelings evoked or sensations experienced. I mentioned Alaska earlier, this dog that is almost a character in the Anna Karenina of Tolstoy. One of the characters in the book is named Levin. Levin comes into his house one day in low spirits, and his old dog Alaska recognizes the mood he's in and comes up to him. So, all right, you're on a brain scan. Watch the neurons. Okay, you imagine her in this passage. Alaska kept poking her head under his hand. He stroked her, and she promptly curled up at his feet, laying her head on a hind paw. And in token of all now being well and satisfactory, she opened her mouth a little, smacked her lips, and settling her sticky lips more comfortably about her old teeth, she sank into blissful repose. And as you imagine this scene, I think the same thing's happening in your brain, according to biology, that would be happening if you had some similar kind of emotion. Now, Tolstoy's taking us into Alaska's essential dogginess, right? Her doghood, if you want to put it that way. Now, imagine that someone objective that we can't really understand another species. See, this is the kind of issue I think you come up against when you're thinking in terms of the politics of identity. All cultures have always known that imaginative experience deeply affects us, that we personify and take on other identities. The very fact that poetry can shape our disposition to choose well or badly reveals its moral importance in the broadest sense. I don't mean its capacity to give you a lesson that you could find in a fortune cookie. Great literature takes us deep into the imaginatively experienced complexities of human character and human choices, but also out into the world itself and all its aspects. And I think here about the way that Homer, this is both in the Odyssey and the Iliad, will cut from some description about, or some scene in the poem, say the Trojan fires out on the plain in front of the Achaean camp. And suddenly we're looking at a shepherd out at night watching his flocks and seeing the great stars overhead. And the movement between the two is kind of characteristic of the way the world opens up. I'll close with a last example of what seems to be a kind of profound insight into identity. And that's from King Lear. And if you know this play, forgive me, but a quick summary of the plot. The old king, he's over 80. He wants to give up his reign. He's tired of being king, he's tired of the responsibilities, so he wants to put those aside and go on and divide the kingdom up among his 3 daughters and be done with it. And he also wants each of them to host him after he gives up his reign with his 100 knights. All right, now you think about that for a second. Dad's coming, but he's not just coming by himself, he's coming with 100 other guys. And he wants you to put him up there, for a while and, let them have fun, enjoy their lives. Well, he's the real folly of what he does is to decide that he's going to decide which of his daughters gets what in terms of dividing England up by how much they say they love him. He already knows that his youngest daughter, Cordelia, loves him the most, so he's putting up this kind of test to justify giving her the most. So the two older daughters, when they're put to the test, rise to the occasion with, most unctuous flattery. But Cordelia, who actually does love him the most, refuses to play, and she embarrasses him. He says, "What shall we say? Give you a third more opulent than your sisters," and she says, "Nothing, my lord." The whole scene escalates, and Lear ends up banishing his favorite daughter. So from pretending to make his choices on the spot, he ends up in this situation where he exhibits himself as unjust, foolish, the worst kinds of traits that he could show. His older daughters, when they are given the responsibility of taking care of him, quickly tell him, we're not going to support these 100 knights. So Goneril, his oldest daughter, sends him off to Regan, his second daughter, who says, "I'm not going to take him either." And King Lear, this great king, from having been in charge of all this, is reduced to nothing when his daughters cast him out of the house where they're all staying. Not even their house, by the way. So here's King Lear in his old age, rash, intemperate, imprudent, and interestingly, what emerges when he's pushed out into this famous storm, the famous storm scene in King Lear, is that his identity begins to show up only when all the trappings and privileges of his kingship are stripped away. Lear cries at one point, "Who is it who can tell me who I am?" But who he is couldn't be plainer. He's every inch a king, as he says to Gloucester later in the play. We can understand why Cordelia loves him so much, or why Kent, whom he's also banished, disguises himself in order to stay with Lear and help him, even though Lear doesn't know it or recognize it. So Lear's greatness, paradoxically, begins to shine more and more powerfully the more he begins to lose his powers. In this failing state, in the storm, Lear meets this poor, mad, nearly naked beggar who calls himself Tom of Bedlam. And Lear looks at it and compassionately exclaims, "Thou art the thing itself. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal as thou art." He starts to take off his own clothes. He wants to strip himself down to these bare elements, but he also wants to help poor Tom. Now, this scene isn't what it seems. An old king compassionately meeting a beggar. Poor Tom, with his insane speeches full of demons and dramatized guilt, is actually Lear's godson, Edgar, not a beggar and not a madman. He's been falsely accused of trying to kill his own father by his deceitful brother Edmund. And he's intelligently hidden from pursuit by reducing himself to this role where he's beyond notice. So he's there in plain sight, but no one can see him. Like Lear, Edgar, in his very identity as he's understood it, has been terribly undercut. He doesn't know who he is. He could say, "Who is it who can tell me who I am?" In terms of any politics of identity, he has no group. He has no identity. He has no way to identify with anyone. Almost ritualistically, he descends into the protean source of identity. And there he recovers his capacity to act, and therefore his real uniqueness. Father Jacques Philippe has a wonderful passage on identity and this kind of self-discovery, where he says the logic of the gospel, one must be lost to be found, applies in a situation like this. He says this is necessary so that the artificial and willful part of an identity is radically eliminated. The superficial me must die so that one's true identity is revealed. Edgar's been victimized, but he doesn't dwell on it. He uses it to broaden his understanding and strengthen his moral authority. As he reemerges from his role as this Tom of Bedlam, he gives his father aid in his blindness. He prevents him from committing a despairing suicide, and he defeats his brother who would otherwise have become King of England. Okay, to close. Through the mystery of identity and the nature of this kind of moral goodness, we can see what literature can help bring about in making us one. An aim that used to be understood as a self-evident good. Great poetry doesn't rob anyone of identity. It opens up our understanding. It helps us not just to see from a distance, but to know the lives of others sympathetically from within. Through great literature, we can begin to see our way toward larger friendships, not antagonistic groups insistent on their differences, and repressing and censoring the very possibility of this protean imagination. Instead of accepting that narrowing circle, we need to heal our future by celebrating whatever deepens our sense of true identity and true common ends. More than we can easily recognize, the poetic imagination doesn't give us fictions or illusions, but the very reality of the real world. If we can persevere in hanging stiffly on with enduring spirit to what it can show us, it can teach us the way home. Thank you. What is Homer trying to get at by having Hector kind of stand in as the substitute for Achilles and dying, and also, how is Homer imagining Zeus as imagining Achilles, as imagining Hector? What Homer is able to do is to take us initially, into the mind of Achilles when he's insulted by Agamemnon at the beginning of the book. Agamemnon strips him of his honor, essentially. He tells Achilles that he's of no worth to the army. That all he cares about is goods and his own ego. Achilles, in response, you remember, he doesn't kill Agamemnon as his first impulse is, but he instead withdraws from the army and pleads to his mother Thetis, basically invoking, one of the destinies that he doesn't realize he's invoking, which is a short life with great glory. But he asks her to go to Zeus and to give him honor, which will mean the defeat of the Italian army in his absence. So, we see something of the identity of Achilles there. He's obviously concerned with what honor is and what kind of respect he gets from those around him. When Zeus is given this petition by Thetis, we almost see into the mind of Zeus. Not quite, right? Homer tells us Zeus hears this and doesn't say anything for a while. And Thetis is there having presented him with this petition. He doesn't say anything, and then she says, well, okay then, don't do it, and I'll know how much I'm the most dishonored of all the gods. You've already kept me from marrying an immortal, which would have meant that my son would be the most powerful of all the immortals. You married me to a mortal instead, and now you're not even going to give the son born of this union the kind of honor he deserves. Again, Zeus doesn't answer. He gives her a fake answer on it. He says, well, this is going to upset Hera. But then he nods to it, and in doing so, puts in place, the destiny that we know is going to unfold. Hector is drawn into this almost inadvertently. He didn't ask for this, in a way, right? He's pulled in because Achilles said, you're all going to fall before manslaughtering Hector. It says this to the Italian army. Hector is certainly an admirable character. Right? He's the breaker of horses. He's the one But he gets pulled into the sense of this desire for glory that makes him more like Achilles. So I think Homer's showing us, this range and the kind of dynamic of identity that's working out some larger issue. And, that's sort of the way people get caught up in the action that they might not even start. I don't know what kind of answer that is to what you're asking, but you gave me a chance to talk about the other things I appreciate. I think that's certainly the danger, right? I think that's why people worry about things like cultural appropriation. In other words, if you take on someone else's identity from certain satirizable external things, then you're using it in ways that are reprehensible. Absolutely. But if you're seriously, as a poet, trying to enter into the identity of somebody else, with cultural, racial, sexual differences, and to see from within, that kind of character, what that's actually like, I think that's an entirely different thing. I think the poet, the very nature of the imagination has to have the freedom to do that, or we're not gonna be able to understand each other. If you take it far enough, you say, well, let's say Toni Morrison, is writing about, beloved or Setha or school teacher. How do people of another race or gender understand, what's going on in that novel, except by the same kind of sympathetic imagination that they were asking, for any kind of literature. I think the poet can't be restrained. If it's not good, mock it. By a kind of criticism, make it it's obvious lack of merit up here. But to repress it to begin with seems to me a very, very dangerous course.
You're a novelist, a literary critic. Can you give any kind of advice, any kind of technique for entering into that identity? Right? How do good authors, essentially, how do good poets, how do they learn how to enter into somebody's identity? Can you give any advice?
Well, I think the first thing you do is follow Keats's advice about what a poet is. In other words, you're not trying to impose yourself onto the character. There's a kind of openness, and it really is delightful if you're ever able to do it. To speak within someone else, to enter this other person and think from within is, it's kind of shockingly fun to begin with. But how to do it, I think it's just, it's a matter of getting your ego out of the way to begin with. I think the other thing to do is simply to read a lot, to have a great familiarity with, as many works of literature as you can, as many poems. I think what Keats is also getting at, though, is that poetry for him isn't so much, a matter of personal self-expression. T.S. Eliot had much the same point in his great essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. The more you enter into the tradition of poetry, the more it becomes less a matter of your own voice getting heard, as if you're trying to express something that takes your own personality, beyond itself. And that's what the poet can do, to open up into the characters of others. So I guess, get rid of your ego, easy to do, and read a lot. That would be the best advice I can do. The best English teacher I ever had was Mr. John Cowan's grandmother, Louise Cowan, who had this kind of extraordinary capacity not to sort of give you ideas about what the literary work is about, but to take you into it. It's sort of the same capacity as I'm talking about with the poet. Instead of abstracting about it, to take you more deeply into it. And once you're in there, the nature of the work itself begins to work its powers. So that you feel it. I mean, literature is, if you get rid of feeling in literature and just make it a, you know, a head thing, you lost it. That's not what it is. It's about the whole person, and particularly the, you know, this capacity to enter something into a felt world, and that world, once you enter it, can teach you in ways that you don't anticipate. So anyway, I think the kind of teacher who can do that is probably the best kind of English teacher. Thank you very much.